Okay, good afternoon everybody and welcome to the ACFA DFAT webinar series, the last one for the year in 2017. And I think we're ending on a really fantastic note, hearing from Mika, the Director of the Disability Inclusion section at DFAT. Before I hand over to him, my name is Beth. I work in the Learning and Innovation team here at ACFA, and I'm just wondering if everybody can hear me, just so that we can kick off. If you can hear what I'm saying and everything is fine at your end, please type in the chat box, just so I know that everything is okay at your end. I can see Janet is writing, and as well as Gabby, Naomi and Rebecca, which is fantastic. Thanks guys. All right, so without further ado, I will hand over to Mika, and we should be going for around 40 minutes today. So stay with us if you can, guys. And towards the end, there will be a survey and we'd really appreciate your feedback. So without further ado, here's Mika. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon everybody. So this is Mika Kontiainen. I'm the Director of Disability in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade over in DFAT. We sit within Development Policy Division, which indicates broadly the focus on disability inclusion is principally a development issue, but it goes beyond that, as I will come to shortly. My area in DFAT is responsible for Australia's international engagement on disability, as well as and including how the Australian Aid Program delivers an inclusive, undertakes an inclusive approach to disability inclusion. So one of the things that I'm not clear on, and I'm a little uncertain of, is how many of the people who are listening today have actually listened to some of the earlier webinars on disability. If you have heard one of my earlier webinars on disability, if you could just put something into the chat box, it just means that I know not to cover too much of the old ground that I've covered before. The presentation that is on your screen, the slides, were actually developed quite a little while ago because this webinar had been scheduled for earlier in the year but was then postponed due to technical difficulties, and quite a few things have actually changed since then. So some of the slides won't necessarily relate directly to what I'm going to say. But let's get started. So Australia's engagement on disability internationally is guided by our strategy, Development for All 2015-2020, subtitled Strategy for Strengthening Disability Inclusive Development in Australia's Aid Program. The strategy itself builds on an earlier strategy that had been in place for about 5 years beforehand, and this particular strategy had been developed over a number of years with a lot of consultation with disabled people's organisations in the region, as well as civil society organisations within Australia, including many ACFA members and including many of the organisations that are participating in today's webinar. When the strategy was launched, it was actually launched by the Foreign Minister at an event in Parliament House where she actually spoke about why disability inclusion is important to Australia. One of the things that has happened recently is, of course, that the Foreign Policy White Paper has been released by the government. And one of the things that you will note in the Foreign Policy White Paper, if you were looking at it through a disability lens, is that the White Paper clearly indicates that disability is a priority issue for Australia's international engagement in 3 specific areas: in human rights, in development, and in humanitarian action. Those priority areas of human rights, development and humanitarian action are reflected in the Development for All strategy, but they are now even more clearly emphasised in the white paper itself. And it is a message that DFAT's ministers, the Foreign Minister, the Minister for International Development and the Pacific, and indeed our Secretary, are sort of promulgating both within DFAT and outside of DFAT to our development partners and our other international partners, that disability inclusion will continue to be a priority for us. So what is disability inclusive development? Essentially, it's a process and an outcome. It's about ensuring that our international development efforts are delivered in such a way that people with disabilities are able to participate in and benefit from those activities on an equal basis with others. That is, participation is the process and benefiting from is the outcome. Now, why do we have such a strong focus on disability inclusion? Well, there's a number of statistics there in front of you on the slide that I've just put up. The common figure that's put out is that about 1 in 7 people globally have some form of a disability. What that means broadly is that, and what we talk about is that development efforts cannot be successful, nor can we meet the promise of the Sustainable Development Goals to leave no one behind if we don't have an adequate focus on those most at risk of being marginalised and left behind. For DFAT, there are 2 groups of people in the community that we are particularly focused on. One is women and girls, and that's reflected in DFAT's focus on gender. The other is people with disabilities. And in fact, it's where those 2 groups intersect, women and girls with disabilities, where we often find people who are most at risk of being marginalised and left behind in our development efforts. So, to achieve the promise of the SDGs to leave no one behind, we must have an appropriate focus on those parts of the community most at risk of being left behind, including people with disabilities. So, what is disability? There are a number of definitions floating around. The one that's probably most commonly used internationally is the definition from the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the CRPD, which defines disability as, or defines people with disabilities as those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual or sensory impairments which, in interaction with various barriers, may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. This definition is almost exactly the same definition that's used by DFAT in our strategy. The only difference with the DFAT definition is that we add in there episodic, in addition to just long-term. Now, the point of this definition is that disability is not simply just about the person, it's about their environment. And in fact, the simple way of considering it is that it is the impairment, the physical impairment or the cognitive impairment or the sensory impairment, which in interaction with the barriers that are present in society creates the disability. So the way to actually approach disability inclusion is not to fix the disability, because disability is part of the human condition, it's part of the diversity of human conditions, but it is about reducing barriers, because by reducing barriers you reduce the impact of disability. So what sort of barriers are we talking about? Well, there are physical barriers, such as stairs or inaccessible toilets, inaccessible roadways, inaccessible transport systems. And these sorts of physical barriers can be overcome by using universal design principles, by actually building your schools or building your infrastructure in a way that is physically accessible, for example. Another form of barrier are the attitudinal barriers. And in fact, it's the attitudinal barriers, stigma and discrimination, which are probably the most pervasive and the most difficult to overcome. It's the attitude of people that people without disabilities, that people with disabilities are not capable of participating, have got nothing to offer, which is wrong. A third type of barrier are communication barriers. So somebody who is mute, for example, or deaf, is not able to actually communicate as well as somebody who is not, unless there is actually some other accommodation made for them, such as Braille or the provision of sign language interpreters. Related to attitudinal barriers, there are barriers that are presented within laws and policies. So one of the barriers that Australia's international advocacy tries to address is changing or removing discriminatory laws and policies that actually prevent people with disabilities from being able to participate in society on an equal basis with others. And this is an area where our focus is very much a human rights-based approach, where we focus on promoting, upholding and protecting the human rights of people with disabilities. Now, those rights are actually spelt out in the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the CRPD. The CRPD does not actually create any new rights, but what it does is explain more clearly how existing rights that are enshrined in international conventions and treaties, how they apply to people with disabilities. It highlights the common barriers, how to overcome them, and it does provide a very useful tool for guiding policy and programming, including the work that organisations that are in ACFID do. Australia ratified the CRPD in 2008. We were one of the very early, we were well involved in the early stages of developing the convention, and we have been a very strong supporter of the convention since. The convention is last year celebrated its 10th year, so it's been around for a little while. Some of the articles of the convention that are particularly important for DFAT are Articles 11, which is about humanitarian action, and Article 32, which is about international cooperation. Those articles effectively compel Australia, because we have agreed to be bound by the convention, to ensure that our international development efforts and our humanitarian action are delivered in a disability inclusive way. So how do we do that? Well, within the strategy, we take a twin track approach. There are two principles we have. The first one is taking a twin track approach, which is one where we look at doing two things in parallel. First is activities which are directly intended to address the needs of people with disabilities. The second is doing things within the aid program that make the broader program accessible to people with disabilities on an equal basis with others. The aim here is to ensure that people with disabilities are included both in the process of the aid program and also in the outcome of the aid program. And we do this in part by applying the principle of nothing about us without us. That is, that we look to provide an active and meaningful role for people with disabilities and their representative organisations, known as Disabled People's Organisations or DPOs, looking to provide them with an active and meaningful role both in the process of the aid program and the outcome of the aid program. There's a great little diagram or picture that I found a little while ago that sort of shows a little bit about how we're trying to remove barriers. So it shows the difference between equality and equity and what you can achieve if you can actually just get rid of the barriers. The diagram, or the picture that's actually on the screen now, is taken out of the DFAT Development for All strategy, and basically just shows the strategic framework under which the Australian Aid Program attempts to deliver what it's doing. So it starts off at the bottom talking about a twin track approach, which I just mentioned, and the importance of promoting reasonable accommodation. That is encouraging support for people with disabilities to enable them to participate in and benefit from development efforts. It identifies 4 areas in particular where there is a greater need for and greater opportunity in disability inclusion. So that includes governance, infrastructure WASH, education, and humanitarian action, disaster risk reduction, social protection. Across the Australian Aid Program, our aim is to make all our aid investments as inclusive of people with disabilities as we can, but it's in these particular areas where the risk of exclusion is greater, and therefore the need to more proactively take an inclusive approach is greater. Our work across the aid program is guided by a number of principles. The first one, which I just mentioned a moment ago, was nothing about us without us. Second is doing our work based on evidence of what actually works and what does not. The third is taking into account the interaction between gender and disability. As I mentioned earlier, gender and disability are the 2 key cross-cutting issues for the Australian Aid Program, and where the 2 intersect, that is women and girls with disabilities, it's where there is multiple discrimination that needs to be addressed. The 4th principle that we have is about recognising the diversity of disability. If you are engaged in disability inclusion or around the world, you'll pretty quickly get to recognise that there are some impairment types, or people with certain impairment types, that are more likely to be seen or heard than others. And in fact, it's people with what we often refer to as invisible disabilities that are less likely to be able to participate. Invisible disabilities include people who are deaf or hearing impaired, or people who have intellectual or psychosocial disabilities. The overall aim of all our work, of course, is ultimately to improve the quality of life of people with disabilities in developing countries. So, just looking at those principles in a bit more detail. So the first principle, which is nothing about us without us, means that DFAT seeks to support an active and central role for people with disabilities in all the work that we actually do. We also actually put a lot of effort into building the capacity of disabled people's organisations to be more effective at advocating for their rights within their own countries. And we also work closely with disabled people's organisations to draw on their knowledge and their experience in developing our aid initiatives and also informing our policy. The second principle about developing policies and programs based on evidence, a lot of our effort there is centred around improving data collection, particularly internationally, on disability inclusion, and I'll come back to something called the Washington Group questions later on in this webinar. But also our efforts are on trying to find, build and share evidence of good practice. We have gone a long way in recent years in terms of advocacy and influencing people. It's not often no longer necessary to convince people that a disability inclusive approach is necessary. However, what is harder is to be able to explain to people, to show people how to actually do it. And so a great deal of effort now is going into building and sharing evidence of good practice. The third principle around the intersectionality between gender and disability is very much focused on the space where women and girls with disabilities who are most likely to be impacted by discrimination on the basis of their gender and disability, which can manifest itself in very low rates of being able to attend school or participate in employment or participate in social life. And even where women and girls don't have a disability, in many families it is common that women and girls are the primary carers for any household members who have a disability, which also then limits their opportunities for education and for employment. The fourth principle is around the diversity. So one of the things, or some of the things that we do to support improved inclusion of a diverse range of people with disabilities is to actually particularly look for opportunities to support individuals and organisations that represent psychosocial and intellectual disabilities, because these groups are more at risk of marginalisation than others. People who are deaf or hearing impaired are another example, and in fact one thing that sort of strikes me in this space is that here in Australia, if you are deaf, you can of course communicate effectively with people around you with the assistance of technology or by using sign language, provided of course you have a sign language interpreter when you need one. The Australian Sign Language, Auslan, is quite widely used within Australia. There's also an international sign language, but in the Pacific, most of the Pacific Island countries do not have a documented sign language. And so just imagine that for a moment. If you are a child living in a community in a Pacific Island country and you are deaf, if there is no sign language in that country, your ability to communicate with the people around you is limited often to what's called home sign, where you learn to sort of use a form of sign language with your immediate family and you're able to communicate with them, but the extent of that communication can be quite limited, and if you are then trying to communicate with people outside your immediate family, it almost doesn't happen. It means you can't go to school, it means you can't go to work, it means you can't participate in social and community activities. It becomes extremely isolating. So finding ways of improving the inclusion of people who are deaf or hard of hearing in those sort of contexts becomes quite important. So the primary areas that we actually focus on, the opportunity areas, includes governance and support, and in particular supporting equality through the implementation of the CRPD, the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So much of our work in this space is focused on supporting disabled people's organisations to be effective advocates, but also supporting partner governments to implement the CRPD. In our region, over the last 10 years, in the time since the CRPD was first ratified, most of our neighbours and most of the countries in the Pacific have now actually ratified the CRPD. There's a few that are still going through the process. The challenge now is implementing it, including making changes to domestic laws and legislation so that they are compliant with the convention. There's a lot of focus on infrastructure and accessible WASH. And when you think about it, if you were to go along and build something in a developing country, if you build it from the very beginning in some sort of accessible way, much the same as here in Australia we are now required by legislation to do, you can ensure that that infrastructure is accessible to everybody in the village and everybody in the community. Education is a major focus for the Australian Aid Program, has been for a long time, and our focus on education includes a focus on inclusive education, trying to overcome the disadvantages of people with disabilities in accessing education. And so Australia's focus on education includes the broader education system support and building that we do in developing countries, but it also includes things such as the work we do through the Australia Awards, In fact, the Australia Awards are amongst the most successful elements of the Australian aid program in actively overcoming barriers for inclusion by people with disabilities. So one of the things that we have learnt over the years is that if you are to enable an organisation like DFAT to actually deliver an effective aid program that is disability inclusive, you need to actually monitor how well you're actually doing. And so within DFAT's monitoring and evaluation framework, we have a system whereby any aid investment that is valued at more than $3 million is required to undertake an annual review process known as an aid quality check, an AQC, which is a self-assessment, looks at a range of criteria about quality and effectiveness and so forth. But within the aid quality checks, we rate the investments, or there's an assessment made as to how well the investment actively involves people with disabilities or their representative organisations, and how well the investment actually identifies and addresses barriers to inclusion. This is a way of measuring how well the process is how inclusive the process is and how good the outcomes are. The slide actually says that it's under the effectiveness criterion. That was actually under the previous format of the AQCs. It's changed slightly this year, but those questions are still there, and in fact those questions are a major source by which we measure how effective the aid program is in delivering an inclusive aid program. Now, what has happened in the last year or so is that the Office of Development Effectiveness, ODE. Now, the ODE is a operationally independent arm within DFAT that does strategic assessments of the effectiveness of the aid program. So ODE has been conducting a series of strategic evaluations into the efficacy of the aid program in delivering a disability inclusive development assistance. The first phase of the ODE evaluation went through and drilled through all the data that came out through the AQCs that we were speaking about a moment ago, and went to look at how well are we actually delivering. What it found was that disability inclusion is rated as satisfactory for about half our aid investments. Or, if you're a glass half empty type of person, disability inclusion is unsatisfactory for about half of our aid investments. Now, for Australia and for DFAT, that is unacceptable. It means we are falling far short of our policy ambition of making the aid program as inclusive as we can. Relative to our international partners, however, we are doing far better than anybody else. We don't know of any other development partner, UK, the US, the Nordic countries, any other partner who actually has an ambition to make the aid program, the entirety of their aid program, as inclusive as we can make it. And therefore, when we talk to our international partners about only half our aid investments are satisfactory, they're impressed that as many as half of our aid investments are satisfactory. Nonetheless, it's not good enough from our perspective, and what we have found is that our performance in disability inclusion is lagging, particularly in the mainstream areas, in the larger parts of the aid program. And what we've identified, or what the ODE evaluation identified, was that DFAT staff continue to underestimate the need and the opportunities for disability inclusion, and that our performance is constrained by insufficient staff understanding of disability, insufficient time allocated to addressing the issue, inadequate use of technical support, and uneven leadership from across senior management. So just to unpick those a moment, because we are actually looking at doing a number of things in response. It's in many cases the insufficient staff knowledge is not that people don't know that disability is important, but they just don't actually understand how to actually address it. There is access to technical assistance that's available, but it's just not drawn on. And while the Foreign Minister, the Minister for International Development and the Pacific and the Secretary and other senior managers within DFAT are strong advocates of disability inclusion and promulgate the message that we cannot achieve the goals of the SDGs to leave no one behind without a focus on disability, at the working level, where you have DFAT staff managing multiple programs at posts in Apia or Phnom Penh or in Port Moresby or Jakarta, those staff often feel as if they're not getting sufficient encouragement and direction from their managers. So we have already started a range of work to try and respond to these emerging findings, including doing things such as improving processes. We're working more closely with our gender and climate change colleagues to embed consideration of these sort of cross-cutting issues in the whole framework of the aid program, particularly in the design, the implementation and monitoring and evaluation processes. We're also putting a lot more effort into capacity development. We have recently renewed our technical partnership with CBM Australia for the provision of technical assistance for DFAT, and we are making sure that, or we are taking steps to encourage staff to draw on that. It's a wonderful resource for DFAT staff, whereby any DFAT officer who has a design document or a concept or some part of an aid investment that needs to be reviewed for and receive advice on how to make it more disability inclusive, in that they can log on to an online portal, DID for All, DID, the number 4, ALL, didforall.com.au. It's a public website which anybody, including you, can actually log into to have a look at a whole range of resources on disability inclusion. But there is a non-public side to it that DFAT officers can use to log in a request for technical assistance, and that is actioned immediately at no cost to the requesting area. What we found over many years is that if you are going to make something disability inclusive, you need to make it in the early stages when you're first designing the process, designing the investment, not trying to retrofit it later. Making a early investment disability inclusive, it can be relatively simple so long as you actually seek the advice early and you embed that advice in early design work. But very few people have got the finances or the time or the inclination to go through a complex procurement process to engage a consultant to help them for work that is often only a couple of days worth. So with this amazing arrangement we've got with CBM, any DFAT officer can actually access this technical assistance quite easily. If there are implementing partners, such as ACFID organisations that are working on the Australian aid program, they feel that they need support in getting an investment, getting disability inclusion and technical advice on an investment, you can't go directly to CBM for that advice, because CBM are only funded to provide advice to DFAT. However, if you work through your DFAT partners, the DFAT partners can actually enter that request on your behalf if they think it's actually appropriate. So hopefully that actually answers Jan's question. We also have a focus on building more partnerships with our disabled people's organisations to actually make them more effective in able to support our work. And we are also working in partnership with our DPOs in the region to deliver training for Australian missions around the world, in developing countries, particularly Indo-Pacific region. So we have a program whereby a training mission of people from my area in DFAT, from the disability section, and CBM will go into, say, Port Moresby or Jakarta and spend a few days there working with local disabled people's organisations to deliver disability training to all the DFAT staff. The the basics of what disability inclusion is, like what I call Disability 101, talk about how it fits into Australia's broader foreign policy priorities, and then move into detailed one-on-one technical discussions with program managers with a view to making individual investments more disability inclusive. So that focus on training, on identifying and disseminating good practice, working with BPOs, and also promoting the access to the technical assistance is all designed to improve the capacity of DFAT to deliver an inclusive aid program. What we do ask though is, with our partners, including our ACFID partners, is that if you are working with DFAT, with a DFAT manager, program manager on a particular investment, we ask you to also actually keep an eye open for opportunities to actually make that investment disability inclusive. The final thing that I'll just mention in under ODE evaluation phase 1 is that we're also looking for more opportunities to continue to build a leadership message. So having had the foreign policy white paper come out recently that clearly affirms disability is a priority for Australia's international engagement helps. Having both the Foreign Minister and the Minister for International Development in the Pacific engaging on these helps. The Secretary of DFAT has been engaged on disability inclusion, and we have a number of other very strong advocates in the senior leadership of DFAT that are promoting this. But we are also working, as I said, with our implementing partners and managing contractors. So in addition to things such as talking on an ACFID webinar, next year, for example, will be the Aid Suppliers Conference, again here in Canberra in February, can't remember the date, at the ANU, and as part of the Aid Suppliers Conference there will be a session on gender and disability and how these two important cross-cutting issues impact on the aid program and how we want our implementing partners and our managing contractors to help us deliver a more inclusive aid program. There is a second ODE evaluation which actually has moved a lot faster, which is looking at the efficacy of Australia's international advocacy. Now, this is actually important because if you step back for a moment, there are, broadly speaking, two things that DFAT does on disability inclusion. One is we try and make our aid program as inclusive as we can. The second is that we try and influence others to do the same. We try and influence our multilateral partners, UN agencies, to be more disability inclusive. We try and influence our partner governments, be they in the Pacific or in Southeast Asia or further out, to be more disability inclusive and to respect disability rights. We work with our partners such as DFAT or GIZ from Germany or CEDA from Sweden or USAID, and we encourage them to try and be more disability inclusive. So a lot of our effort actually goes into influencing others to do more on disability inclusion. And hence, it was appropriate for ODE to conduct an evaluation of how well are we actually going in our global advocacy efforts. And what the evaluation essentially has found is, and I'll move on to the next slide, what the evaluation essentially found was that Australia is seen as a credible and effective advocate for disability inclusion. The evidence is fairly clear that our sustained advocacy over many years has led to important outcomes, including transforming UN policies, UN agencies and other organisations. There is a view that Australia's leadership there is a view that Australia's leadership on advocating on disability rights and disability inclusion remains as important now as it was 5 to 10 years ago. And so that's in fact is reflected again in the the foreign policy white paper with its emphasis on disability inclusion. Now, if you're interested in the detail of this, what happens with ODE evaluations is that all ODE evaluations, when they are finalised, they make a series of recommendations. DFAT provides management responses to those recommendations, and then the report, the evaluation, the recommendations and the management response are made public. Now, the ODE Phase 2 evaluation, I was told this morning, should be published by the end of this week, by Christmas. So if you're interested in looking at that, just go onto the DFAT website, search for ODE, and you will see all the ODE reports are listed in there, and you can actually have a read about how Australia is doing on our international advocacy and what the recommendations are about securing and building on that progress, and what DFAT's response to those is. The Phase 1 evaluation, that hasn't been published yet, because what DFAT, or what ODE has decided to do, is to do a third phase looking at a series of case studies, and then to merge the Phase 1 and Phase 3 evaluations into a single report with a single set of recommendations, and present those to DFAT. At this stage, we anticipate that this combined Phase 1 and Phase 3 evaluation report will probably come out in maybe the end of the first quarter, or maybe the second quarter of next year, so perhaps May. It's a bit hard to tell. These things do take some time. So what are we doing in terms of influencing people around the world to be more disability inclusive? We do use the full range and breadth of Australia's diplomatic network to actually engage on and advocate and conduct policy dialogue with partners. Some of the key points that we engage in are at the Conference of States Parties to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is held in New York in every June. The CRPD is one of those human rights treaties that are particularly important in helping to shape international norms and standards. Related to that, a few weeks ago on International Day, which was on the a few weeks ago on International Day of Persons with Disabilities, which was on the 3rd of December, the Foreign Minister announced that Australia would be nominating a candidate for the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and that's an Australian academic by the name of Rosemary Case. Rosemary is a woman with a disability. She's an academic, she's a human rights expert and a disability advocate, and we are hopeful, indeed we are confident, that Rosemary will be elected to the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities at the convention, at the Conference of States Parties in June in New York next year, which means that we will actually have an Australian, a well-known and well-regarded Australian, on that treaty body that helps to interpret and provide guidance on disability rights globally. And it's an important adjunct and an important complement to Australia's forthcoming role on the Human Rights Council, where our focus also will be on upholding, protecting and promoting the rights of people with disabilities. A couple of other things that are coming up in the near future which are significant. One is GLAD, the Global Action on Disability Network, which is a fairly new international coordination mechanism of donors such as DFAT, DFAT, USAID, so donor countries, UN organisations, private sector and foundations, organisations that are essentially working internationally and contributing significant resources to disability inclusive development around the world. That grouping, GLAD, is currently co-chaired by Australia as the rotating co-chair. The permanent co-chair is IDA, the International Disability Alliance. The last meeting of GLAD was held earlier this year in Berlin and was co-chaired by Senator the Honourable Concetta Ferranti-Wells, the Minister for International Development and the Pacific. The next GLAD meeting will be held in Helsinki in the depths of winter at the end of January, and Australia as the co-chair will be co-chair again at that meeting, and the Australian Minister will once again be travelling to Helsinki to co-chair that event. GLAD's focus is on improving cooperation, collaboration amongst its members on disability inclusive development around the world, and it has a particular focus on inclusive humanitarian action, inclusive education and inclusive social protection. So they're the three thematic areas it focuses on: humanitarian action, education and social protection. It also strongly promotes better disability data as well. This year, or sorry, rather next year, next month, the GLAD meeting will also help to shape something that our colleagues in the UK have recently announced, which is an intention to hold a global disability summit in July in 2018. That Global Disability Summit will be co-chaired by DFAT, the UK Department for International Development, and the International Disability Alliance, and it'll be the GLAD partners, including Australia, that will be working closely with them to actually help make that summit a success and get some tangible outcomes for people with disabilities from that summit. Now, finally, I've mentioned a couple of times the Washington Group questions, so I thought might just come back and explain what they are. So if you are at all interested in data, this is really important. If you're interested in monitoring and evaluation, this is also important. It's also actually important because if you're an ANCP partner, the DFAT's funding of ANCP partners comes with a number of expectations, and one of them is that ANCP partners disaggregate their data by gender and disability. Of course, how you disaggregate data by disability can be a real challenge. It's simply not effective if you're collecting data to ask, do you have a disability? The evidence over many, many years shows that those sort of questions are ineffective in identifying people with disabilities, because either due to stigma and discrimination, people don't want to self-identify, or people actually don't recognise that they actually have a disability. And so what happened, this was identified as a really significant data issue by the UN Statistics Commission over 10 years ago. It was recognised an issue for census data a long, long time ago. And what the UN Statistics Commission did, as they do whenever they come up with an intractable data problem, is that they set up what's called a city group. And that city group is made up of representatives from national statistics offices. The Australian Bureau of Statistics is our national statistics office. This city group of national statistics officers brings together the best statistical minds on the subject, and they try and find a solution to resolving that data problem. The city group that was to resolve how to collect better disability data in censuses first met in Washington over 10 years ago, and hence it's called the Washington Group. And what this group has done over a very, very long period of time, over 10 years, is they've developed a series of tools that are used, that can be used in conjunction with other data collection tools to be able to collect data on disability and to be able to then disaggregate your data by disability. So the idea is that you take what's called the Washington, there are a number of tools, but the core tool is the short set of Washington questions. You take these 6 questions, and wherever you are collecting data on individual level data, you also ask these questions, and in doing so you're able to collect more reliable and comparable data on disability inclusion. The interesting thing with these questions is that if you look at them, the word disability does not appear in there at all. You do not ask people about disability, you ask about their impairments, you ask about their ability to do things, such as seeing, hearing, walking, remembering, self-care and communication. But rather than simply ask a binary question, a yes, no, you are asked, no, do you have no difficulty, some difficulty, a lot of difficulty, or cannot do it all? And then you then set your cutoff depending on where you actually need, you wish to set your cutoff. The international norm is that anybody who answers a lot of difficulty or cannot do it all for any one of the 6 domains is considered to be a person with a disability. I won't go too any further into those questions other than to say that the UN the UN Statistics Division and the Washington Group have recently issued a communique affirming that the Washington Group questions provide an effective and efficient tool for collecting and disaggregating data on disability for the purposes of monitoring the SDGs implementation and implementation of the CRPD. There are lots and lots of other data tools out there, and if you need more detailed information about disability, you do need to use other data tools. But if you are simply trying to disaggregate your data and to determine whether or not your programs are reaching people with disabilities, this is one way to go. And so, coming to the end of my my presentation, if you are looking for more information at all, if you need to contact my area, the disability section in DFAT, you can use the email address disability.inclusive.development@dfat.gov.au. Our Development for All strategy is an incredibly useful resource as well and worth having a look at. It is available online. And of course, now we are starting to, as of the end of this week, there will be an ODE evaluation looking at part of that. There is also available what's called the Accessibility Design Guide. This was a comprehensive guide that was prepared by the old AusAid some years ago on how to actually design investments in an inclusive way. That guide is still available and is still current and relevant. The help desk that DFAT has with CBM, the address for that again is www.didforall.com.au. As mentioned, it has got a public section on there, so if you log into that website, you will see that there is a whole lot of very useful, very good resources on disability inclusion available there for publicly available there. If you wish to actually seek technical assistance, however, you cannot do it through the help desk directly. You would either have to work with one of your investment managers within DFAT and ask them to do it on your behalf, or you can always, of course, approach CBM seeking their assistance, but that would be an arrangement between you and CBM. And finally, more information about the Washington Group questions is available on the internet. The Secretariat for the Washington Group actually sits with the Center for Disease Control in the US. Go figure. But that's where you'll be able to actually find more information about the Washington Group questions. So with that, I have now been talking for about 50 minutes. I could quite easily actually talk for a lot longer, but I fear that that could result in information overload. So I don't see any questions coming up on the chat box. Are there any questions? Just give it a few moments. No, it doesn't look like there are any questions. So with that, I will actually wrap up my presentation. Oh no, I think somebody's writing a question here now. So as I'm waiting for the question to appear on the screen, I just wanted to emphasise once again the key point, some of the key points. Firstly, disability inclusion is a priority for DFAT and for Australia. It is evident in the Foreign Policy White Paper. It is evident in our disability strategy. It is evident in what you will hear the ministers saying from time to time. Our approach to disability inclusion is both one of making the Australian aid investment as inclusive of people with disabilities as we possibly can, and for that we need the support of our implementing partners, which includes our ACFID partners, and we also have a very strong focus on influencing others to actually take a more disability inclusive approach. Now, within the white paper, there is no specific reference to the Development for All, but the way, if you're looking for disability within the white paper, the simplest thing to do is get the Word version of the white paper, an electronic version, and just search for DISAB, D-I-S-A-B. It'll throw up where the references to disability are, and you will see that in the sections that talk about human rights, talk about humanitarian action and talk about development. They're fairly short sections. It identifies disability as being a priority area. What's interesting too is that in each reference to disability in the white paper, it is alongside a reference to gender, which highlights once again the important intersectionality between gender and disability. So, with that, I will thank you all. Oh no, somebody else is still typing, so I won't just close off just yet. So Susan has asked, is there support at DFAT Post to support our partners to upskill on the Washington Group questions? So indirectly, yes. If you are working with a DFAT Post on a program, you can work through your investment managers, and through them you can seek assistance, technical assistance on disability broadly through the Did For All help desk. But if you're looking for specific advice on the Washington Group questions, you can actually contact the Washington Group directly. While the Washington Group was originally set up to support national statistics officers to collect better census data on disability, what has become evident over time is that the questions are a very practical tool at the program level as well. And so supporters of the Washington Group, such as Australia, are providing funding support to the Washington Group to give them more capacity to respond to help inquiries from non-government organisations as well as national statistics officers on how to utilise the Washington Group questions for collecting and disaggregating data by disability. So if you're looking for Suan, for information on the Washington Group, you can either work through the Washington Group directly, but if it's more broader questions on disability inclusion, work with your investment partners at Post. Thank you.